Hello, I'm Dr. Gillian Ray-Barruel from QE2 Hospital and Griffith University, and in this session I'm going to talk to you about reviewing the literature and writing your literature review or report. So now that you've downloaded all your references into EndNote, as I discussed in the last video, there's so much to read. How are you going to narrow this down, right? Don't get overwhelmed. We're going to have a process. So it's about taking a systematic approach and keeping records of each step. Now, I mentioned in the last episode that in EndNote there's a rating function. So what I recommend is you use the rating function to systematically screen your titles, screen your abstracts, screen your full text articles, rank your articles by relevance, and you will end up with 5 stars, most highly relevant articles. Now, once I've got everything in EndNote, and I've narrowed it down, and I've now only got, say for example, 10 papers that I want to really analyse, I'm going to set up an Excel library and Excel spreadsheet and put the data into Excel. I'm going to make up different columns for author, year, country, study design, setting, sample size. Did they need ethics? What sort of an intervention? What sort of a control group, if there was one? What sort of primary outcome measures were they looking at? What sort of secondary outcome measures? What were the author's reported outcomes? What did the authors make of those outcomes? What sort of quality assessment or risk of bias needs to be done on this paper? And then what sort of funding or grants or industry, how do they actually get this research going? I'm going to put all that data into Excel. That's a lot of data. It's going to take a couple of us doing this, but we'll get there. And when you get there, you end up with a table, for instance, like this, that is going to be, that's in my final publication. So it is a lot of work, but that's how you do it. You can see at the top there, I've got my first author, my year, my country. In the next column, I've got my study design. How long did it go for? How often did they collect data? Well, who was the population? What was the sample size? This was my study on bundles, so I've got my bundles there. I've got my implementation strategies, my reported outcomes. We collected, there's a lot more data than this. This is just a small snippet of the final table. But this gives you an idea of how you're drilling down into the data that you're finding. But you don't have to put it in a table. Now, this is very interesting. This was a scoping review that my colleague Mari Takashima and my other colleagues, we did together. And Mari had the brilliant idea of putting our results into a spider web. And you can see very clearly there that for this topic, the points of the spider web show you which was the most common topic found in the literature. Now, this trial, this scoping review was about randomised controlled trials in central vascular access devices. And we found that there was a lot of evidence on insertion-related topics, but there was very little evidence on dressing and securement. And that's very clear from looking at the spider web, whereas if I was looking at a big table of data, that might not have been so clear. So I think it's fine to be creative with your research and use a graphical representation. Is sometimes the best way to get your results across. So here's the bundles systematic review. And what I want to show you here is the equator network is an absolutely essential resource for anybody who's writing any type of paper for publication. This is the Prisma page, and There's the PRISMA checklist and the PRISMA flow diagram, absolutely essential if you're doing a literature review because it steps you through the process. There's the PRISMA flow diagram from the bundles paper. I stepped through this in the last video, so I won't go through it all again, but just to say that you need a PRISMA diagram to show how much literature you started with, what you excluded, and what you ended up with. Critical appraisal tools, there are lots of different ones for this, so it depends on the type of literature review you're doing. It depends on what you want to get from this, but there are a lot of appraisal tools out there. And then you're going to critique the findings of each paper. And to do that, you ask, is the study question relevant? So, as I said, you've gone through your EndNote, you've weeded out by title and abstract, and now you're really looking at the study question. Is it relevant to your study? Did the authors make their aim clear? Did they use an appropriate study design to answer the question? Did they do appropriate statistical tests? Did they provide raw data? There's no point in saying, you know, we reduced our bloodstream infections by 25% without giving some raw data, because, you know, 25% of, 4 is 1 out of 4. It's 25% out of, 1,000 is 250. You know, what sort of sizes are we talking here? Because just a percent doesn't give you anything. It doesn't help. So you really want to know, how big was the sample size? You know, how long did they follow people up if they did? How many people dropped out? Why did they drop out? You know, maybe the treatment had terrible side effects and people wanted to drop out. These are all sort of things you want to know. So the authors always come up with a conclusion. Take a look at the data. Does it justify the author's conclusions? Don't just read the discussion and believe the authors. You've got to go and look at the data and make sure that it does justify what the authors say it does. And then you've got to look, are the findings generalisable to other populations or settings? Or is this a very small, this is going to have very small relevance to anybody else? Is there any evidence of bias? Are there conflict of interest? You know, was this study paid for by the manufacturer of the product that it supposedly worked? You know, you've got to ask those sort of questions. Do the findings from different studies agree or contradict one another? Because they won't all agree, usually. This is a risk of bias table, and for a systematic review, because you're looking at randomised controlled trials, etc., you need to know, were they randomised? How were they randomised? Was allocation concealed from people who were doing the randomising, or did they know which group was most likely to come up? Were participants and personnel blinded to the treatment arm that they were receiving? That's very difficult sometimes because you can't always blind participants and personnel, especially if it's, for example, a different type of dressing or a different a drug or something. It can be very difficult. If you can get a placebo, that's great, but it's not always possible. But what you can always do, 99% of the time, you can blind the outcome assessment. So, for example, you could blind the microbiologist, or you could blind the person who's then coming along and just looking at the data and not at the patient, and they don't know what treatment the patient got. They're just looking at the final results. So you can usually blind your outcome assessment. do the authors report all the outcome data that they said they were going to report? Because if they don't report everything that you would expect to find, maybe they have a reason for hiding that data. It's something to consider. So how selective were they? And was there any evidence of other bias? As I said, was the lead author, an employee of the company providing the drug or the equipment, etc. Lots of things to think about here. But the risk of bias table sets it out really nicely there. And then for a meta-analysis, as I discussed in video 3, it's a graphical display of results from a number of scientific studies addressing the same questions along with the overall results. Now what you get here is a forest plot. So it sort of looks like a tree. And you've got the lines for each study. And down the bottom you've got a diamond, and that's the composite of the results from all the studies. If it falls on the left-hand side of the line, the middle line, it favours the treatment. If it lands on the right-hand side, it favours the control. If it touches the line, the result is not significant. There's still some ambiguity there. And now we've got all this data that we've analysed. We've got it all into a spreadsheet, and we're going to write the literature review. The literature review uses a process, IMRD or IMRAD, and it really looks at the introduction is why did you do this? Method is how did you do this? Results, what did you find? And the discussion is so what? So you've got to be able to answer those questions. So the introduction, about 500 words at the most, sets the scene, briefly identifies what's been done before in the area, describes the rationale for this review. Why did you do this review? The methods, it's about 750 words, roughly. This is all give and take. Describe the search strategy you used. What databases, what search terms, which inclusion and exclusion criteria. How did you extract the data? How did you analyse the data? What sort of risk of bias assessment did you do on the data? The results, 750 to 1,000 words. How many studies did you find? How many studies made the final review? What sort of populations? What were the sample sizes? Themes, results. What about the bias and quality assessment? So there's quite a lot to put in results, but you're not interpreting them here. You're just presenting them. The discussion is where you're going to interpret, analyse, synthesise, pull it all together in relation to the research question. It's about 1,500 to 2,000 words. You're going to take all your findings and weave them in relation to the question to identify and pull it all together and tell the reader what is known and what remains unknown, unclear. Because remember, that's why we did this literature review. We did it to identify what is known and where is the gap, what needs to be done in future. And also any limitations. For instance, I couldn't review the literature in another language because I only spoke English. Or we didn't have time, or we didn't have the money to hire somebody else, so I couldn't do a systematic review. I had to limit it to a scoping review or a narrative review. So how could the review have been improved? Well, it could have been improved if we had more time, more resources, we had other languages, etc. Then, because it's all in EndNote, it's very simple to make a reference list using the reference software. So now that you've got your EndNote library there, you've got your Word document open, working together, you build your reference list. EndNote will let you format that in any required styles such as APA or Vancouver or Harvard, Chicago, MLA, etc., and come up with your list. If you don't know how to do that, you need to go to EndNote training or come and have a chat to a researcher or a librarian who can most certainly help you. Keep calm, ride on, don't give up. There are the references. Thank you very much for listening. And go and have a look in your hospital library. There are some excellent books on conducting a literature review, or come and have a chat to your friendly researcher or librarian. We're always here to help you. Thank you.